Hello everyone, I'm Dave Thomas, and today I am building the MIM-23 Hawk. This is a scale model of a surface-launched missile by Rocketarium. And so we'll just go ahead and open this thing up and make sure that we've got everything here. Alright, so find the instruction sheet. It'll have the parts listed in it. It may also have things like parachutes and such hidden inside of it, so be careful that you don't lose something there. Okay, so we've got our parachute, pre-cut main fins here, it says main channels. I think that may be that block of wood there. Let's see. Alright, main body tube here. Okay, baffle kit. Alright, here's our nose cone, and then we have a tail cone. And then in one package here we've got the motor mount and its parts. That's all the stuff here. And then in the small parts area here we've got 2 launch lugs, a shock cord, and then 30 grams of clay that will be put in the nose to make sure it's stable. So it looks like we've got everything here. Alright, so this is actually not the channel, this is a spacer that we'll use for the baffle. Look inside, there we go. Okay, so inside the body tube in this case, these are the 2 main channels, and these will run along the length of the body tube. Alright, so now it looks like we have everything we're supposed to have, so we'll clear this away and get started. The first thing the instructions have us do is simply identify the aft end. So this body tube is all pre-marked here. Alright, and so the part here with the 2 short marks, those will be for the launch lugs, and the aft end has the launch lug right at the base there. So I'm just going to turn this around, and inside it I'm just going to write aft so that later on I don't get confused and put things on the rocket backwards. We'll set that aside and now get the motor mount kit here. Alright, so again, a lot of the parts may be inside each other here. Okay, so here's the motor mount tube. This is a spacer. We don't want to have that glued in. This is also a spacer. This is so that you can launch D and C size 24mm motors in this tube. This will actually accept the longer E and F sizes. Okay, we've got a hold down ring, a thrust ring, and 2 centering rings there. So according to our instructions, we are going to put in some glue here, and one of the things they include is this applicator here for doing glue, and you can use this more than once if you're careful. You can also just buy these in bulk, which is what I do, so I'll probably just keep using different ones here. Alright, but the first thing we're going to do is take our motor mount, and here again I'm going to mark one end as aft. Do it on the inside. Alright, and so now we're going to put a ring of glue inside the forward end at 3/4 of an inch or 19mm inside. Alright, now you can measure this to get exact dimensions. I've done enough of these where I can pretty much estimate it. Okay, And then we're going to take the thrust ring, but we're going to put it in the aft end of the rocket, and then our spacer here after it. And now we're just going to stand it on its end and push down on that spacer. And as you can see, that pushed the thrust ring through the glue. Take this out immediately, so if there's any spare glue in there, it doesn't lock it in. You can see there's a little bit of glue there. Okay, so we don't want to glue that in the tube. If you've got a lot of excess glue here like I do, you can go ahead and just smooth that into a fillet. Just like that. Okay, and we're just going to let that dry for a moment. Now we're going to take our motor mount again and measure 95 millimeters or 9.5 centimeters from the aft end. It's going to be right here. Make a mark there. And we're going to cut a slit there that's wide enough for our engine retainer clip. It should be about 3 millimeters wide. So just cut in, and if you look on top, that should put it right on the top of your thrust ring. And that will pop right in there. Okay, and then we're going to make another measurement here at 2.5 centimeters or 1 inch from the aft end. I'll put that next to the clip there. Okay, and then this ring is going to go up here. We're going to put a ring of glue around here and then push that through it and then up to our mark like that. Okay, so here again you can use white or wood glue. Today I'm actually using white wood glue. Alright, so we'll just put a ring around here. And this doesn't have to be a really strong bond. The ring just holds the engine clip in place. It's not accepting a lot of thrust or other forces on it. Okay, we'll just move that up to our mark, which is right where that little bit of glue is. Alright, and again, if you have a lot of excess here, you can smooth that in. I don't have a lot of excess on mine, but I'll smooth as much as I can. Alright, so now we're going to take the rings here. Okay, now one of them says down on it like this, and that one is going to go here. Okay, so if we take our tail cone here, and right now I'm just going to dry fit everything. So I'm going to put this down, and don't push on that ring until the glue dries. Alright, come down here. Alright, so the aft end of the motor mount tube should go right up to the base of the tail cone there. Okay, and then our ring that says down on it, that's going to face downward. It's actually got a little bit of a taper to the cross section there. And it's got a little slot that's going to go over the engine clip. So that's going to go down like that. Okay, and then once that's glued into place and properly centered, that's not quite centered there. Now it is. Okay, then the second one can go in either orientation, and it's got a little slot there that's going to go just over the engine clip like that, so that when this is all finished, it'll look about like that. Okay, so everything looks like it's going to fit okay. I'm going to go ahead and pull this back out, and that back out. There's a little bit of raggedy edge here. I'm going to take a small amount of sandpaper and just quickly sand that. Alright, so this is just some 100 grit sandpaper. Just about anything between 100 and 220 will be fine for this. But this will just help it seat into the tail cone a little bit better. There, something about like that. Okay, so according to the instructions, okay, we're going to put a whole mess of glue down in here. Alright, so we've got these ridges here down at the bottom, and we're going to put glue all the way around in there. And we need that to be fairly thick, because as the glue dries and fills up those ridges, that's what's going to hold it in place. Because our glue really isn't going to stick to the plastic on this very easily. Now here you might want another applicator or reuse the one that came with the kit, just to help smooth this around. Alright, and then try and keep the glue out of the slot there for the engine clip. Okay, so now we're going to take this, okay, orient it so the engine clip is going to go through the slot. Okay, I'm just going to push that in. Now, all that excess needs to come right out of there. So have some tissue or a rag handy, but we don't want to leave that there. Okay, so get as much out of there as you can. If in the end of all this your glue is a little bit thick inside and it's interfering with things, you can sand it out later. Okay. So now we're going to run a bead of glue around the engine mount right above the tail cone connection there. Okay, and now we're also going to run a bead of glue around here. Now again, we're being fairly heavy with this because we're depending on the glue to get into the little ridges of the 3D printed part there to lock everything in place. Alright, make sure we've got our downside of this ring. Alright, we're going to push that down, and that's going to go through both rings of glue there, both in the tube and in the coupler. And we're just going to hold that down. Okay, so make sure that's even all the way around. I'm just going to hold this in place for about 30 seconds and then come back. 30 seconds have passed, and here I'm just going to wipe off any excess glue that's on here. Alright, and now I'm going to run a bead of glue just above where the motor clip ends there. And then we'll take the other centering ring here, and again, it doesn't matter which side faces where. Alright, but we do need to line up that little notch with the engine clip. And we're just going to push that forward into the glue. Okay, and then a little off there. Get that as straight as you can, and then any excess glue here, just form into a fillet with your finger. Okay, and then if you want, you can put another fillet on the forward edge. Smooth it around. Right, and then make sure you haven't knocked it out of straight. Okay, and now I'm going to let this thing entirely dry for the next half hour or so. Next we're going to assemble the baffle, and this goes together just like on almost any other Rocketarium kit. time for a new blade on that. Okay, so some of the pieces might be inside there, and this has its own instructions. So first thing we're going to do is find the baffle plate that has the hole in the middle of it there, and then take the screw eye here and run it through. And again, you can do this from either side, whichever you like. Okay, so I'm just going to thread this in. Alright, just till it comes out the other side. Now I'm going to take some more glue here. I'm just going to squirt that through. A little dab on the other side there. A little more up here. Basically the glue is going to help anchor this in place in addition to its own threads. Okay. Alright, so then go ahead and re-thread this. Alright, so in the inside here, it's going to poke into that glue. And back here on this side, I'm going to go in just so I can see about 1 turn's left of thread there. You don't want to go all the way up to the smooth part of the shank, because that will not hold anything. Alright, we'll just let that set for just a moment or two. Wipe up my spilled glue here. Alright, so now over here we're going to take the baffle plate that does not have a hole in it, and we're going to add a fairly thick bead of glue here all the way around. Okay, and then this is going to go right into that. And I'm going to push this in so it's just below flush. Leave a millimeter or 2 of a lip there. Alright, we'll come back to that. Okay, and then for the other one, we're going to take some more. Alright, so they say to make this wide and thin. So we'll just kind of see what we can do here. You can make it thick too. It's not going to make a whole lot of difference. I do like to have these very well glued in place. I really like them. I've had really good luck with these. So I'm going to put this in, and now I'm going to twist as I pull it back out. And that's why they have you do a wide band of glue there, is because it's actually going to spread itself both inside and outside that baffle plate. Alright, so I'm just smoothing that in on the outside to make a fillet. And again, I'll bring that up to within just a couple of millimeters here. Okay, make sure the little holes are not being blocked. Alright, now I'm going to come back to my other side and use some of this excess glue to make a fillet here. Now if you get any on the outside of the coupler there, go ahead and wipe that off immediately so it does not obstruct later insertion. Alright, I'm going to go ahead here, put in a little bit more glue to just get a nice even fillet. Because this thing will have to be able to handle the stress not only of ejection, but also when the shock cord goes taut against it, it's going to have some tension riding on it as well. So we want this well glued in place. Alright, it's going to look something like that, and this also I will set aside to dry for about half an hour. For the next step, we're going to add the weight to the nose cone. Alright, so this is basically modeling clay. We're going to take that out. Now, the weight is necessary for this rocket to be stable. Okay, so don't skip this step. Now, if you want to use some other form of weight, than the modeling clay, you can, but make sure it's at least 30 grams. So for example, some people like to put in BB shot into the nose and then cover that with a layer of epoxy. That works fine, just make sure you have the same amount of material there. Okay, so this stuff you can just kind of break apart here, and you make little balls or little worms. It just needs to fit down through that hole. And I'll usually do a couple of these first and then mush them down and then add some more to it. It's going to need to be a little wormier. That one's more of a slug than a worm. We'll get that in there. Okay, and now you're going to need something to push that down, and you can use a dowel. If you have a long enough handle on your hobby knife, that'll work, though mine's not quite long enough. Alright, but I do have a dowel here, and so now we'll just take this and pack it down. Alright, so that looks pretty good. It's not going to go anywhere soon. You can take, if you want, a tissue here and just remove the excess there. I recommend at this point washing your hands so that the clay material doesn't interfere with glue and other things later on. Something else to consider while we have the nose cone here is what you would like to do with the seam. Okay, so this nose cone was put together in two parts, so we have two seams on it. And depending on how smooth you want your finish, you can just ignore this completely, or you can sand it, or if you really want to go far, you can use some plastic contour putty to fill in the gaps. So I'm going to start with some sanding paper here. Alright, so I'm going to start with 150 grit sandpaper, and the first thing I'm going to do is just sand along those seams. Okay, and that by itself knocks down a lot of the ridges that were there. And sometimes you can just keep sanding this and it'll smooth out the valleys as well. You just remove quite a bit of material. Alright, now I'm going to just quickly wipe this down using a little bit of rubbing alcohol here. You can just use water as well, or just do it with a dry cloth. I use the alcohol because it evaporates quickly and catches a lot of the dust. So now when we look at this, you can see the sanding scratches, but most of the imperfections are gone. You can still see a little bit of some of the valleys in here. Okay, but I think I can get away with just sanding on this one. As I said, if you want to get if you do have really low valleys in here, they're really obvious, you can use some plastic model contour putty, and that you can get in hobby stores. It's kind of a paste to putty consistency, as its name implies, but you can just smooth that in, let it dry, and sand it. Now what I'm going to do is switch to 220 grit sandpaper now. not only to sand this smoother, but I'm also going to go all the way around the nose cone with the 220, and that's going to help the primer and the paint adhere better to the plastic. Alright, so that has made the sanding scratches finer and more uniform, and this will give us a really nice surface for the paint to adhere to. Okay, there are just a little bit of valley left in there, but I think my primer is going to take care of that. So what I'll do now is put a couple of coats of filling sandable primer on this, give it a little bit of sanding, and that should give us a nice smooth surface that's ready to paint. And this is something you can be doing while glue is drying on the other parts. I'm still waiting for the glue to dry on my baffle and my engine mount, and so here I'm going to start work on the fins as well as the channels. And so the first thing to do here is just to give them a brief sanding, and I'm just going to do this with one fin, and then we'll go off camera and do the rest. Okay. You also want to be thinking about if you want to do any type of fin treatment. I'm going to use a polyurethane based sanding sealer on mine. That's up to you how smooth you want to get your fins or what treatment you want to use. You can also use paste type wood fillers here, or if you've got a lot of it, fillable primers will also fill in the wood grain. So that's kind of up to you. You do need to be a little bit careful as you're working around here, this area, okay, so that there's only a little bit of balsa there and we don't want to snap those. So the instructions recommend rounding the leading edge here. And so I'm going to start with 100 grit sandpaper. And first I'm just going to knock down the corner edges here. Okay, do that on both sides. Now it's up to you if you want to continue your rounding all the way down here. I am not going to, just because there's a greater chance of damaging that. Okay, so we'll come back to the rounding here. Now once you've got those edges knocked down a little bit, then just come back and alternate sides initially, knock them down a little bit further. And then as you go along here, you can start imparting a curvature by changing the angle while you're sanding. And you can either turn this part or you can turn your wrist with the sanding paper on it. I use the sanding tee. You can use a sanding block. Some people just do it freehand. It's kind of up to you and your own preference. But these fins are fairly thick, and so rounding them is going to take a little bit of time. Okay. Now also, since these are really long fins, the tendency is going to be for it to bite more in the center here or wherever you're holding it. As you move out toward the ends, there's not as much pressure on it, so you don't get an even rounding. Just be aware of that and fine-tune things as you go along. And then once you're actually getting into having rounded edges there, frequently check it in cross-section to make sure you're not favoring one side or the other. Okay. And now I'm just going to do the faces. Okay, and then the root edge and trailing edge, and just sand those square here. Alright, now inside the fin here, it's going to be really hard to get a sandpaper in. There are a couple things you can do. One of the easiest is to simply use an emery board. Okay, so something like this, and you can just get in there and just lightly sand it that way. All right, now if you don't have anything that fits in here, you can probably just ignore it. I just like to remove that soot when I can because it paints easier that way. Alright, so that fin is pretty much sanded. I'm going to sand the other fins as well as these channels off camera. Now the channels, all you have to do is just sand the surfaces and the edges, and that's it. Okay, you don't need to do any shaping or things like that. If you want to, you can round this a little bit. Just keep in mind that you're going to have this glued against the tube. Okay, so this is going to go pretty much like this. Okay, so if you want, you can smooth down that, or just kind of round the corners of that a little bit. But most of the fitting of this, you just sand this flat, and then we're going to have some glue fillets going all the way around the whole thing. Alright, so I'm going to do all the rest of this stuff off camera, and then when I come back, we should be able to put the motor mount and the baffle in. I have all of my fins sanded, and now I'm going to apply some sanding sealer. And for the method I'm using, you're going to need a piece of corrugated cardboard, and this can be a box even. If you have an open box that has an exposed edge, that works. In this case, this is a makeshift rocket stand that I made using an old motor and some corrugated cardboard. But we just need these holes showing because we're going to use those to hold the fins in place. And then you're going to need some straight pins, preferably the long thin kind like I have here. These are actually biology dissection pins. And we're going to put this into the root edge. Okay, it doesn't have to go very far, and don't poke it through and poke your finger. But you want it in a place so that it'll hang like this. Okay, now I'm using a polyurethane sanding sealer, and several manufacturers make this. And you can use either a paintbrush or an applicator like this. All right, and all I'm going to do here is just spread this on. Now, the lot of balsa that these fins were made from was cut at kind of a transverse angle, so it's got lots of exposed grain, and it actually made it hard to sand. It does not want to sand smooth, and so the sanding sealer will actually help that. But in this case, if I go in this direction, you can see how it's grabbing the cotton there. And if I go in this direction, it goes on fairly smoothly, and that's due to that transverse nature of the cut. And that's just kind of the luck of the draw with whatever the balsa manufacturer was doing that particular day and what the tree looked like. Okay, but that pin will also give you something to hold on to while you're doing this. Now this is an oil-based but water cleanup, so it's an emulsion. If you've got young children doing this, I don't recommend this. Use a water-based wood filler instead. That's going to be safer for them. Or if you're going to use this, make sure they're closely supervised. And here we want to get all of the edges except the root edge. If you do happen to get it on the root edge, just sand it back off later on. Alright, you can get these inside edges as well. Okay, you want to make sure that you've got everything, but you don't want this dripping and running. Okay, so once you've got it done, you can go ahead and stick it into the corrugated cardboard like that and let this dry. Now, the number of coats and the amount of sanding you do is going to depend a lot on personal preference as well as the nature of the wood here. I usually use 2 coats with a light sanding in between and then sanding after that second coat. If you really want to make sure you get all that wood grain gone, you can go up to 4 coats, maybe even more. If you do a lot, and then by a lot I mean multiple coats with minimal sanding, that can actually change the weight of the fin, and you might need to add a little bit of nose weight to the rocket to keep it stable. Okay, but you have to add a lot to do that, and usually it's not a problem. So I'm going to do the other fins off camera. While the sanding sealer is drying on the fins, we can now go to the motor mount here. Right, the mount itself is dry. My fillets are still a little bit wet there, but it shouldn't be a problem. First, I'm going to dry fit this into the aft end. So I need to come back here and make sure I find where I marked aft. Alright, so this should slide in pretty easily. If it doesn't, you may need to do a little more sanding. So like right there, that aft ring is just a little bit too thick. So I'll go ahead and sand this a little bit. Okay, now something else we can do is just take a thumbnail here and kind of chamfer out the inner edge there. Sometimes you get a little bit of cardboard that kind of rolls inside there and makes it hard to get in. There we go. Alright, now we have these 2 raised areas. Those need to be in the channels. Okay, so this is the channel marking here, and there's one over here. And then our channels, once that is glued into place, will go in like this and line up with it and go along the whole length of the body tube there. So you need to make sure that this is properly aligned. And I also prefer to have my engine clip on the same side as the launch lug. So the launch lug lines are here, and here's my engine clip. All right. Now the only other way that this will go together and still line up with the channels is if this is turned 180 degrees. In which case now my engine clip is opposite my launch lug. Now the reason I want it on the same side is it's less likely that the engine clip will be getting in the way of the igniter and things like that. That's personal preference there. Alright, now we're going to need another applicator. You can also just use a scrap piece of wood or something for this. And we're going to do this in 2 stages. So first I'm going to measure 1.5 inches. I know it's not metric, but that's what it was in. And I'm going to put my thumbnail there. Okay, and now I'm going to get the glue. All right, I'm just going to dip that in there. Okay, and now I'm going to stick this in until my thumbnail hits, and then I'm going to bring it up against the inside edge and circle all the way around there. Okay, make sure I've got glue all the way around. I'm going to go ahead and give it another layer there. just to make sure. Okay, now when I'm going to put this in, once again I need to line it up, but I'm not going to push it in all the way yet. I'm just going to put that ring in there, just enough that I can set that off at an angle like that. And now I'm going to put a ring of glue right in the inside edge. Okay, and I can turn this over. Do it there as well. Okay, and now the reason to do this is it allows the forward ring to have its own ring of glue without pushing up all of the glue that the aft ring would need as well. Okay, so now I'm going to turn this once more, line everything up. Okay, so there's my line for the channel. It needs a line here. Alright, and there's my launch lug line in line with my clip. Okay, so now I'm just going to push this all the way in. Okay, make sure that's lined up there. Give it just a little twist back and forth. Spread the glue. And then make sure I'm aligned. There, there, and there. Okay, I'm going to set that aside to glue for just a couple of minutes, and then we'll come back and put the baffle in. Now while I'm waiting for the glue to dry on the motor mount there, along the channel lines, I'm going to use a little bit of sandpaper here and just roughen up the surface in between those lines. You don't need to do a lot. This is just taking the glossiness off, and this will allow the glue to stick better. Okay, I'm going to do that on both sides. And eventually we'll do that same process for the fins and the launch lugs as well. But the channels are going to be going on the soonest. Now I'm still waiting for glue to dry here, so while I'm waiting, I may as well just go ahead and do the whole thing. So I'm going to do the same thing here along the fin lines. And on the launch lugs. Right, now I use 100 grit sandpaper for this. You can use just about anything between 100 and 220. Okay, that's not going to go anywhere. So now we need our baffle and we need the shock cord. Now if you'd like to substitute out a Kevlar shock cord, you can do that now. I'm just going to go ahead and build this using the supplied materials. Alright, so before we put this in, we need to mount the shock cord here. And they do give us a pretty generous rubber shock cord, so that's good. Alright, so we'll take one end here and tie that to the eye using a double knot or 2 half hitches. Okay, pull it from all directions, and then you can just take a little bit of your wood glue or white glue here and just touch that on the knot, and that'll help lock it in place. Cut back the excess on the free end there to about 1/4 inch or about 6 millimeters. Don't cut it all the way back to the knot or it can come undone. Okay, now we're going to need some glue at about 5.5 inches from the forward end. So just like we did with the other one, we can take our applicator, take some of the glue off there, alright, measure against the ruler here. Alright, so that's going to be almost at the end of my applicator. So right about there. It's better to be a little bit short than too long. Okay, and now I'm just going to do the same thing as before. I'm going to put a ring of glue in there. And we want this to be fairly thick, not dripping, but thick and uniform, so that our baffle doesn't come flying out of there with the ejection charge. Okay, now we're going to need that one little stick of balsa. This thing here that I initially thought was the channel, but it is not. Okay, so now we're going to slide this in. The shock cord and the eyelet should be facing forward. Okay, so poke that down, and then we're going to use this to push it all the way in. There we go. Now mine is grabbing the glue already, which can be a hazard here. I'm going to push that in. There we go. Okay, so it's best to do that as quickly as you can so that glue doesn't have time to set, but make sure that the glue on the baffle is completely dry, or you may end up shoving a baffle plate through it, and at that point you pretty much are kind of messed up there and you have to take the whole thing apart and maybe salvage it. Okay, but the way it is now, I don't know if we can get enough view down there. Alright, but that's all the way down in there. And then I'm just going to let this dry once more by pulling this a little bit taut and then turning it over on its end, and that will keep the shock cord out of any remaining glue that's in there. Okay, so that's going to set for about 10 minutes while the glue dries, and then we'll come back and put on the channels. The motor mount assembly and the baffle are both inside and fully cured. Now I'm going to add the channels here. I have not put any sanding sealer on these yet. I decided it will actually be easier to do that after they've been mounted. Okay, we did previously do the sanding of the channel area. So now, first I'm going to get a couple of tissues handy to wipe my fingers here. You'll also probably want to have some masking tape handy. Okay, so here what I'm going to do is simply run a bead of glue down this. And I don't want a lot. I'm going to smear this out here. So we want a nice uniform bead of glue, but we don't want a lot of excess. So we'll just kind of smear this around. Okay, all the way up there. Alright, now we need to place this between the two laser etched marks there, and then we're just going to run this all the way up like that. Alright, that's trying to drift on me there, so we want to keep those marks should be hidden on both sides, and then make sure we keep this all the way down. And now I'm going to take some masking tape just to tack this stuff in place while the glue dries. Okay, and then we're going to do the same thing on the other side. Alright, now we'll let that dry, and once it's thoroughly dried, I'll come back and do the sanding sealer on the channels themselves. I've removed the masking tape that was holding the channels on here, and so now I'm going to give them a brief sanding with 150 grit just on the top here. Now after I had done this, I've had the realization that I won't be able to use a fin alignment guide with these in place. So I'll have to put my fins on the old-fashioned way and eyeball them. So if you do want to use a fin alignment guide to put your fins in place, put the fins on before the channel. I'm going to apply some sanding sealer to the channels. And so first thing I'll do here is just tuck the shock cord away. And we'll stick a few tissues down in there to keep it from moving out. Okay, now the instructions do call for fillets on the channels, but I'll put those on after I do the sanding sealer. So I'm using the same polyurethane base sealer here. And here I want to be careful not to get it slopping down along the edges. It won't really hurt them, but it may make lumps and smears and drips that I'll have to sand away later on the body tube. And it's just easier not to do that first of all. And just like the fins, you can do as many coats of this as you like till you get the desired finish. You just need to do a little bit of sanding in between each coat. And one of the other things this does is it helps to lock down the little fuzzes and slivers you see on there. Now something else you want to think about is whether you want to do anything about the texture here of the tail cone. Okay, so this is 3D printed. You can see little filament lines. You can actually use some sanding sealers to fill those in if you like. You can also use wood putty or plastic model putty to do that. I actually kind of like the texture of it, so I'm just going to keep it there. And I'm going to let this dry now off camera. And I'll probably put at least one more coat on it, but I'll do that off camera too, and we'll come back when it's all done. The sanding sealer on the channels is dry, and I've already sanded it. So now I need to add the fillets. Let me get some paper towel here handy. Now usually I would wait and do the fillets after I do the fins and all the other stuff that's going to require fillets. But once this is all put together, things are going to get kind of tight. So we're going to have these long fins in here. We're going to have launch lugs over here. And so I think it's just going to be easier to do the fillets now rather than trying to do everything all at once. So otherwise, it's just like any other fillet. So we're just going to add a bead of glue along here all the way down. And then we're just going to take a finger and smooth that in. Okay, and then just wipe off the excess there. Alright, then I'll let this dry horizontally, and then if needed you can add more to it, but really these don't need to be built up. mainly their job is to hide the little bit of a seam that's going to go between the channel and the body tube. So I'm going to let that dry off camera, and by the time it's done we should be about ready to put the fins on.